Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 22nd of April of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And today we will talk a lot about talks that are going to take place tomorrow in London. I'll remind you that tomorrow the delegation of Ukraine, France and the United Kingdom, as well as delegation from the United States of America, are going to have a meeting on the territory of London where they're going to discuss this peaceful settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. And this is a very important date because we see that the United States of America are trying to do everything they can but to stop this bloody war before the victory day, before the date anniversary of the end of the Second World War. So we see that the United States of America are trying to do everything they can, but we see that for example the 47th president of the United States has prepared his own plan, and when talking about his plan, Ukraine appears ready to give 20% of its land to Russia as long as it is considered de facto recognition, not the de jure Trump promises to reveal the contents of the peace plan in the next 3 days. So he is going to do this tomorrow, most likely after the talks between US, UK, France and Ukraine itself. And most likely then, if everything is okay, everything is confirmed by, let's say, Ukrainian side, if Ukraine is able or is going to accept everything that will be proposed by the United States of America, then most likely, and according to information we have, Witkov will travel to Russia with the purpose to discuss this situation with special aide Yuri Ushakov and probably with Vladimir Putin himself. So tomorrow we are going to understand for 90% whether the conflict in Ukraine is going to be finished in the very near future, or this conflict is not going to be finished probably during spring, summer, or maybe even in 2025. And anyway, we have lots of statements, lots of red lines from the Western countries, especially the red line from Zelensky himself, that he is not going to accept any territorial changes of Ukraine itself. But we know that this is one of the most important demands from the Russian side. But the Russians are also saying that it's too early to talk about these talks. We need to understand that first of all, and in the end of everything, the Russians will sign any agreements with Ukraine, not with the United States of America, not with France, not with the United Kingdom. So that is why first of all Zelensky himself must to remove any, let's say, problems, any barriers for himself and for the Ukrainian authorities to talk with Russians, because you know that at the beginning of the special military operation the Ukrainians adopted one important law that doesn't allow the Ukrainians, anybody from Ukrainian side, to have any talks with the Russians. And this is the first trap, the first thing, because the Russians are saying that, for example, Zelensky can't do this because he's not a president anymore, because the Russians don't see him as a legal president. And this is the main problem. So the Russians have some possibilities to play with this situation and to force Ukraine and the Western countries first to stop this war just from their side, to, let's say, make president elections, and only then to return to the situation. But obviously if this situation happens, the Russians will have more than 6 months to continue the special military operation, of course, to get additional territories during this period of time. As for the current situation, the Russians are saying that if you want to have talks with us, and if you are ready to talk with us, and if you're ready to talk about the Ukrainian territories, first of all, we are going to take in account experience of Easter Truce, because I'll remind you that when talking about Easter Truce, according to raw estimations from the Russian side, the Ukrainians broke this Easter Truce for more than 4,900 times. So obviously by this statement the Russians are saying that maybe we are ready to start discussions, but we understand that we can't trust Ukrainian words, because they promise to reduce and they promise to establish Easter ceasefire, but at the same time they broke this Easter ceasefire for more than 4,900 times. And we, during the previous video, discussed this situation. We discussed that Ukrainians during the Easter Truce managed to restore control over some territories in the Novopavlovka direction, in the Lyman direction, and of course in the Sumy direction. And now we see that that was probably big mistake from the Ukrainian side. Now let's return back to the line of combat contact, and first let's talk about the Sumy direction, because we have lots of very interesting updates. And today we will continue with the church, with the territory, with this complex, because as you can see we have lots of icons from this area. And I'll remind you that this morning we got this video, and in this video we can see how the Russians were bombing the territory of this church complex with FAP 1500, and the Russian sources reported that as a result of this attack they managed to destroy the temporary deployment point of the armored force of Ukraine. This video is very important because I'll remind you that on the 17th of April we had lots of updates that the Russians managed to take this territory under complete control. So we have lots of videos with the Russian flags. And the thing is that according to different neutral resources, neutral mappers, the Russians today, or let's say yesterday, or during the Easter truce, Easter ceasefire, lost control over this church. The Ukrainians managed to counterattack and to restore control over this territory. Of course, now before the beginning of talks in London, we see that that was one of the biggest mistakes from the Ukrainian side, because now the Russians most likely will think twice before making any decision regarding Ukrainian, let's say, statements and promises. Anyway, the Ukrainians established control, then the Russians attacked this territory, and most likely then the Ukrainians were forced to fall back, because later, more precisely today, let's say in the second half of the day, we got this video where we can see how Russian soldiers were moving on the territory of church, how Russians were evacuating their wounded soldiers. So by the end of the 22nd of April, once again we got enough of proofs that confirm complete Russian control over this territory. So first the Russians lost, now the Russians restored, and now the Russians have very powerful trump cards before talks that are going to start tomorrow. The Russians intensified their activity in the northern part during the previous 24 hours. We also got a lot of videos from the Hryhorivka direction where the Russians were bombing and attacking positions of the armored forces of Ukraine with the use of aviation bombs and lots of drones. So when talking about explosions, today we have lots of explosions. Several explosions took place in different places of Ukraine, and there was one big explosion to the east of the city of Moscow, the capital of the Russian Federation. Today the Ukrainian sources start publishing this video where we can see very huge explosion, and later we got reports and several sources managed to geolocate this explosion. According to information we have and according to the geolocation, somebody destroyed or somebody damaged this warehouse. So this warehouse was destroyed, and obviously that was a very huge explosion. As for now, we don't know for sure whether it was some accident or maybe the Ukrainian special operation. We believe that in the very near future we will understand this and we will find this out. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kharkiv direction. The city of Kharkiv was under very heavy fire during the day. The sources reported that the Russians began using new type of drone of Giran, improved Girans. Once again, the Russians improved this type of weapon. Lots of explosions, and according to information we have, the Russians attacked and destroyed several military facilities that Ukrainians were using to support to build some drones, maybe let's say some arms or something like this. Maybe the Russians were destroying some positions and warehouses of Ukraine, because we see that the Russians intensifying their activities in the vicinity of the settlement of Volchansk. Today we got this video where we can see how the Russians were attacking the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine in this area with Torske flamethrower system. You know that we've been talking a lot about this situation in this area for the previous 5-6 days or maybe several weeks, because the Russians mainly were focused on destroying Ukrainian logistics. Lots of bridges were destroyed, and when the bridges most likely were destroyed, the Russians began the second phase of this operation, and now most likely the Russians are planning to establish complete control over the territory to the north of the river of Volcha. So this is the river, and the Russians most likely will try to take this territory as a part of operation to create a secure zone. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the southern Kupiansk or the Lyman direction. As for the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything additional with the situation that we discussed in the previous video. This is the second place where the Ukrainians broke the ceasefire, and as a result of counterattack, the Ukrainians managed to restore positions to the east of the village of Ryhorivka. So based on this article published by neutral mappers, we have adjusted the map. So most likely the Russians will restore control over this territory in the near future, but this is another example how the parties were following on the Easter ceasefire. We have a lot of updates from the village of Torske. We have another episode of violating of Easter ceasefire, probably from when talking about this area from both the Russians and the Ukrainian side, because the Ukrainians managed to restore control over the village itself, but the Russians managed to improve their positions in the fields and so semi-encircled the eastern part and the northern part of the village of Torske. At the same time, the Russians continue bombing the Ukrainian positions on the territory of the village of Zaporizhzhia. In this video, for example, we can see how the Russians managed to discover the positions of the FPV drone operators of the armored forces of Ukraine, and then we see how the Russians destroyed these positions with Lurmur missile. A bit further in the western direction, and several vehicles were ambushed by the Russians with the use of FPV drones. So we see that the Russians control this territory completely. Ukrainians have no chances to carry out successful rotation, evacuation, supply and support of their contingent on the territory of the village of Torske. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Sirius direction, probably the toughest nuts that the Russians managed probably to face since the beginning of the special military operation. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians continued their offensive operation in the direction of the settlement by the name of Hryhorivka. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians improved their positions, and we have geolocations that confirm this. In this video, we can see how the Ukrainians from the 81st Air Mobile Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine were hunting and attacking the evacuation group of the armored force of the Russian Federation. There are several episodes in this video. One of them was geolocated exactly in this point. Furthermore, we got another video, this one, where we can see how the Russians were hunting, attacking and destroying Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian communication, Ukrainian strongholds and the temporary deployment points with the use of multiple launch rocket systems. This is very important video because we see that the Russians are getting closer and closer to the settlement of Hryhorivka from the south. It's very difficult to make any projections regarding dates, but most likely May is the final months for Hryhorivka being under control of the armored forces of Ukraine. We expect that by the end of May, most likely this village will be taken by the Russians and the first clashes will start taking place for the village of Serebryanka. The Russians are gaining momentum. The Russian offensive in this area is gaining momentum, and the Russians are moving faster and faster. As for the Konstantinovka direction, as usually, we receive probably the biggest number of updates exactly from this area. Let's start in details, and let's start with the city of Chasiv Yar, where the Russians still haven't managed to crack the citadel of the citadel of the city of Chasiv Yar in the central part. But now we see that the Russians managed to bring additional heavy artillery systems, and in this video we can see how the city of Chasiv Yar was reduced to ruins using these stealth flamethrower systems. You know that usually if the Russians begin using stealth flamethrower systems, this means that in the very near future the Russians are planning to begin operation on the ground. So we see that different parts of the city of Chasiv Yar were bombed by the Russians. We expect that during the next several days, maybe 1 week, the central part would be taken and the units of the 24th Mechanized Brigade would be forced to fall back from this area, those who managed to survive, of course. When talking about the city of Torske, we see that the main activity took place along the railways between the settlements of Druzhba, Dachna, south in Delivka, and further in the northwestern direction towards Alexander Shultine. We see lots of icons, lots of flags, different sources tell different things, but we see that there are lots of common things. First of all, most of the mappers, pro-Russian neutral mappers, reported that the village of south in Delivka was taken by the Russians. The Russians established complete control over the railways, and the Russians during the previous days were not allowing the Ukrainians to bring additional reinforcements and reserves to the south in Delivka. So we see that the Russians control the situation, and we expect that the Russians will continue. As for this offensive, as for this local offensive operation, the primary target for the Russians is to establish complete control over this territory. If the Russians are able to establish complete control over this territory and to get to this intersection of true lines on the railways, then the Russians will be able to cut this territory in two, and then the Russians will be able to handle with every single pocket separately. The Russians will try to cut this pocket to the south of the northern Hryhorivka, and the Russians will try to take under control this dense network of the fortifications and to establish stable, let's say, supply roads between the settlement of Nilipovka and the city of Torske. So the Russians are advancing, and the Russians are trying to get as close as possible also to the city of Chasiv Yar from the south. As for the southern Kliban-Bytska direction, the southern Konstantinovka, as usually these days we are getting more and more updates from this territory. And the most important update was published today by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, according to which the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Sukha Balka. As for now, we still haven't received even a single video that can confirm this. Furthermore, we got several videos where we can see how the Russians were bombing the positions, how the Russians were bombing positions of the armored forces of Ukraine in this area, and but sources report that this is archival video. Anyway, we believe that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, the Russians, more precisely the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, will confirm this, and most likely during the next several days the Russians will publish video with the Russian flag as well. And we can see that this is very important, let's say, foothold, because if Ukrainians lose control over this territory, then the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back further in the northwestern directions towards the settlement of Romanovka, because this is the only place, the only area where Ukrainians will be able to show more or less, let's say, really reliable defense or reliable resistance, strong resistance to the Russians. Because when talking about these fields, obviously these fields will collapse automatically, and the Ukrainians, probably showing almost no resistance, would be forced to fall back. And this is a very big problem for the Ukrainians, because if the Russians are able to improve their positions and move further in the northern direction, then the villages of Shcherbinovka and Leonidovka would be taken by the Russians in pincers, and then the Russians will begin advance towards the positions of the 1st Military Corps. We're talking about the positions of the 12th Special Purpose Brigade Azov. And if Ukrainians lose Shcherbinovka, this can bring a lot of problems for the Ukrainians, including some encirclement or possible encirclement of those Ukrainians who are currently located between the settlements of Staraya Mykolaievka and Zarya, because like this, the Russians can attack further in the north and then to the west, trying to attack Alexandra Shultina from the east. So the Russians can maneuver whatever they like, and this can bring some problems in the future for the Ukrainians. As for the Pokrovsk direction and Novopavlovka direction, this is, let's say, the third place where the Ukrainians, according to neutral and pro-Russian resources, violate the Easter ceasefire, and Ukrainians managed to restore control over some territories. You know that that was probably a very big mistake from the Ukrainian side, because Easter ceasefire was very important, let's say, thing from the Russian side, not just to save lives or to show the readiness to finish this conflict. The Easter ceasefire the Russians announced the ceasefire also with the purpose to understand the real position of Ukraine, of Zelensky. And the Russians just wanted to see whether Ukraine itself is ready to peacefully settle the conflict. But most likely, and according to statements that were made today by the President of the Russian Federation, we believe that President of Russia came to the conclusion that Ukrainians are not ready to settle this conflict in the peaceful way, because too many times the Ukrainians broke this Easter ceasefire, and too many territories were recaptured by the Ukrainians. And I believe that maybe some territories were probably abandoned by the Russians for a reason, just to show whether the Ukrainians are planning to use these seconds, these hours of Easter ceasefire, let's say, for their own purpose and for their own, let's say, needs, and for the needs of military like Zelensky and Syrsky himself. So, and we see that's most likely, and according to Putin, Ukraine failed this test for the Russian understanding of the situation. And you know that Putin today made a very interesting statement. He told that somebody from the Western countries at some moment told Zelensky to stop. He gave some, some tip. He gave somebody told Zelensky to stop, and maybe this is the reason why we saw just 4,900 of breaks of the ceasefire, but not, let's say, 10,000 or even more, which would lead to complete collapse of any talks between Russia and the Western countries. As for the South Donetsk direction, the Russians continue offensive operation. As for now, there are very heavy clashes for the southeastern part of the settlement of Bogatyr. The Russians are bombing the settlement of Alexeyevka, trying to not allow the Ukrainians to bring additional forces from the village of Alexeyevka in the southern direction with the purpose to stabilize the situation in Bogatyr. According to this press and according to these updates, we believe that the Russians are going to break through the Ukrainian defense, no matter what, no matter the price. So the battle for Alexeyevka Bogatyr has begun, and the Russians will try to take these territories. As for the Zaporizhzhia direction, we have lots of updates, as you can see. According to different mappers, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, and according to neutral mappers, the Russians improved their position significantly, and the Russians took under control the southeastern farms. Furthermore, we have this geolocation that was published by the Ukrainian side, and in this video we can see how the Russian vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles were moving to the southeast of Kamenska. We have some offensive operation from the Russian side, as you can see. And based on this video, we have adjusted the map because Russian vehicles were spotted exactly in this point. Furthermore, as we can see, the Russians established complete FPV drone control further in the northern direction with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to introduce additional forces along the line between the settlements of Kamenska, Shirbaki, Mali, Shirbaki. So the Russians continue their offensive here. The Russians are not planning to stop. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians attacked massively with drones the city of Odessa. Also, lots of explosions and a lot of attacks were recorded. The Russians were trying to destroy as many as possible military facilities that Ukrainians used to build weapons and arms for the armored forces of Ukraine. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.